Did a Roman legionnaire ever hold that coin? This is a question very commonly asked by people when they handle a Roman coin for the very first time. And for our joint excitement, most coins, especially those made out of precious metals, they were very likely at some point handled by a Roman legionary. That is because the money spent with the army was an enormous part of the empire's budget, ranging from 60 to maybe 80%. And since so much of Rome's money was at some point inside a soldier's pouch, that's what we will be discussing today. What was the salary of a Roman legionnaire? Or even better, how much did a Roman legionnaire earn? Because it turns out there were multiple potential sources of income for a Roman soldier, much more than simply their salary. So there's a lot to cover. Let's get started. Now, when talking about a subject like that, we need to understand that we will be discussing a fairly broad time frame. The concept of the legionnaire began around 100 BC with Gaius Marius. As time went on and Rome entered the imperial period, the idea of the legionnaire changed. There were reforms on how the army was organized. The late Republican army was different from the imperial army, which was also different from the late imperial army, because after all, we're talking about a good 500 years of history here. But surprisingly, there were a few ways Roman soldiers made money that were surprisingly consistent throughout this period. And they were, at first, the stipendium. The stipendium was their actual salary. There were donativa or donatiua, which were different kinds of bonuses that a soldier could expect. He could expect lots of different bonuses throughout their career, from spoils of war to new emperors coming to power and giving them a little extra to earn their loyalty. And depending on the time period, there were even sign-in and discharge bonuses at the beginning and end of their time at the legions. For this video, I will not get into like cavalrymen or centurions. I will focus on the low-ranking legionnaires. So, when a recruit finally took the oath and joined his unit, he received a sign-in bonus called a viaticum, literally travel money. In the early empire, this was commonly 3 aureus, 3 gold coins. So he could either be handled 3 gold coins or 75 equivalent in value silver denarii. This bonus certainly served as a morale boost, especially if the recruit was a poor Roman who joined the legion in a search for a better life. But the idea behind the viaticum was more practical. It was meant to cover the journey to the camp where his designated legion was located. So it was meant to pay for a few days worth of food, lodging as he made his way to the camp, and as a state-sponsored help to buy his equipment. And here's where we start seeing that this bonus might not have been that generous. Apart from the travel expenses, recruits were expected to purchase their equipment, and it was a lot of stuff. We generally think about the most obvious part of the kit, their shield, the sword, the armor, but there were lots of other tools and equipment that had to be purchased. When Gaius Marius came up with the idea of the legionnaire as this dependable, versatile soldier, people made fun of how much equipment this new type of soldier had to carry. They even nicknamed them Marius's mules. And if you showed up to your new base with an equipment that was considered below the minimum quality required by the legions, or even worse, if you were missing part of the standard kit, the local quartermaster would provide you with whatever you lacked to be up with their minimum standards, and he would immediately note the charge against your account. Every single soldier had an account in the legion's ledger, and there were soldiers who were almost exclusively responsible for the bookkeeping of the legion. Any deductions came out of whatever balance you had left from your viaticum, and if that wasn't enough to put you up to standard, then the money would come out of your subsequent paydays. The point was that you were going to be with an equipment that the Legion considered adequate. It didn't matter if you had to forfeit a year worth of salaries. The point was you were going to be properly equipped. And today's video is brought to you by L5, the new ancient coin marketplace. L5 is a platform developed by coin collectors for coin collectors. It offers the lowest transaction fees on the market, from 5% down to 0. No listing fees or undisclosed reserve prices, and you can choose between buying and selling coins through its auctions or its fixed price lists. The most important idea behind L5 is generating an environment of trust between people. You can buy, you can sell, you can do both if you want to, all within a system of transparency and accountability between its users and the platform. Apart from a lifetime guarantee of authenticity in case any coin sold on L5 turns out to be a counterfeit, the platform works with a group of renowned experts on different fields of ancient numismatics and a body of expert moderators, with the objective of creating an environment of high trust where every single coin is reviewed by more than one person and curated by an input from the community. I think their concept of collaborative accountability, low fees, and transparency is a revolution to the ancient coin market, and I can't recommend the L5 enough. Give them a look. I personally think this is a wonderful concept that the ancient coin market was in need for. Visit l5.com. And since I just mentioned paydays, let's talk about salaries, the stipendium. Once more, as I said, we're talking about 500 years of history here. So what constituted a salary changed a lot. But if we start by using as a reference the army under Augustus, rank-and-file legionnaires' basic pay was 225 denarii per year, paid in 3 installments, effectively 75 denarii every 4 months. Paydays were typically at January 1st, May 1st, and September 1st. This amount didn't stay the same throughout the imperial period. There are records of raises to the salary. So, for example, under Domitian, he added a 4th payment, which scholars interpret as an effective 1/3 raise, bringing the total amount to 300 denarii. Basically, what he did was he reorganized the installment, making it a 75 denarii payment every 3 months rather than 4. This figure of around 300 denarii per year seems to have been kept for the late 1st century and most of the 2nd century AD. Now, did these raises make the soldiers richer? Generally not. They were mostly inflationary corrections. Let's keep in mind their salary paid under Augustus was made in the shape of very high quality denarii, coins of around 3.9 modern grams and a marvelous purity of like 97% silver. But unfortunately, Roman emperors had the terrible habit of reducing the silver content of the denarius, and sometimes even the official weight of the coin as well, as a way of stretching the imperial budget a bit further. As the denarius' silver content eroded over the 1st century, the purchasing power of this original nominal 75 denarii stipendium, it eroded with it. So, for example, Domitian's extra payment, it helped mitigate this slow inflationary creep, as in his time, the denarius was down to 3.4 grams from 3.9 under Augustus, and its fineness had fallen to 93%. It doesn't seem like much, but Rome was effectively in a silver standard at that time, so every 1/10 of a gram of silver had very real purchasing power, and throughout the years it added up. And I'm afraid it gets worse. So far, we've only talked about gross salaries. Legionnaires didn't have to pay income tax like we do, but they did have to pay for all of their expenses. Their actual take-home pay could be half of the headline salary, or maybe less, once all of their maintenance expenses for food, clothing, replacement gear, anything they needed to do their work was fully counted for. Estimates show that only around 50% of a stipendium generally reach a soldier as cash. The legion certainly purchased goods in bulk, and this must have helped provide the soldiers with more reasonable prices for their necessities, so at least the legionnaire knew any money that actually reached their pouches was theirs to do as they pleased. But still, that's a 50% cut. That must have hurt. And salaries were of course exploited for political gain. Emperors learned very quickly that raises bought loyalty. So, as an example, the Severan dynasty and the following emperors, they were great examples of this. Septimius Severus, an emperor whose rule rested squarely on the support of the army, after all, he came to power after a civil war, he doubled the legionnaire pay to around 600 denarii. His son, Caracalla, then raised it by half again to 900. And then Maximinus Thrax, a soldier emperor who exploited a frontier crisis to become emperor, he doubled it again to an eye-watering 1,800 denarii. We're talking about an increase from 600 to 1,800, a 3 times increase in just 27 years. That was unheard of. That happened right before the empire plunged into the 3rd century crisis. And one of the things that precipitated this crisis is that the soldiers knew they had real power, and every emperor knew that they had no other choice but to pay. As for the treasury, who had to come up with the coins, the message was also pretty clear. Strike whatever number of coins is necessary to pay every single soldier. And by now you might have come to the conclusion this whole thing with emperors rising to power through civil wars only to be ousted from power a few years later isn't exactly good for your average Roman trying to conduct businesses without interruptions. By the 3rd century, the Roman economy saw a major downturn, which decreased the amount of silver and gold in the shape of taxes entering the imperial coffers. Meanwhile, the emperors, squabbling for power and knowing they would have their heads chopped off if they didn't pay the army, well, they just instructed the mints to make more coins with whatever silver they had available. The result was a negative feedback loop. Higher military payments with less silver, which led to more debasement, that is the reduction of the intrinsic value of an individual coin without changing its denominational value. This led to inflation, which led to more demand from the soldiers for raises to compensate the inflation, leading to still more debasement, more inflation, so on and so forth. This cycle continued for a few more decades, and by the 260s, the coins were nearly valueless, with as little as 5 to 2% silver in a coin, and the entire monetary system ended up so dysfunctional that it would require a complete restructuring. And it was more than just this collapse of money. This inflationary spiral in the 3rd century, it really changed how the army paid its troops during the late empire of the 4th and 5th centuries. At this time, there were still coins. The empire managed to survive and recover, but the pay package changed. The late Roman monetary system had coins of gold, silver, and bronze, but the value of bronze coins was volatile. It often changed as imperial edicts changed its value, and their connection to silver and gold coins lost its practical meaning. People couldn't really save in bronze coins, so soldiers demanded their payment in just gold, silver, and in case those weren't available, in anything that had value. So as you can see, this mistrust on government-issued cash ran very deep, and people seem to have preferred the safety that came with things that had intrinsic value in them. This led to a large fraction of late Roman soldiers' compensation being paid in kind as goods. Grain, wine, olive oil, and meat, for example, show up in texts as payment, and non-food items were also given. Think about clothing, equipment, tools, anything, any kind of good a person basically needed to survive. So, for example, the comitatensis, the late Roman successor to the legionnaire, had a salary of around 16 solidi per year. The solidus was a gold coin. Most of this value was in the shape of rations and goods, with only a small part being paid as hard cash. This must be where the myth that Roman soldiers received their salary in salt comes from. And I mean, it's very possible that part of that salary in kind that soldiers received was in the shape of salt rations, and it was, after all, an important component to preserve food, but there's no literary evidence for salt as like a salary for Roman soldiers. And I know there's a similarity between the words salt and salary, but this is more of a grammatical coincidence. Salarium is like a general Latin term for any kind of recurrent payment. The late imperial pay-in-kind system was basically grain, clothing, and equipment, and most of the cash was composed of gold, because the late empire operated under a gold standard. The most hard cash comitatenses would ever see was probably when the quinquennial bonus came. At this time, soldiers served in smaller contracts of 5 years, and as they finished their cycle, they received a donative of 5 gold solidi. I don't know where we should draw the line here between a donative and just a normal part of your salary, because this bonus was tied to your contract, so it wasn't really a bonus, it was a contractual obligation on the part of the army. But since we just mentioned bonuses, let's talk about the donativa. This was like a series of extraordinary payments a soldier received during their career. Donativa were lump sums given to the soldiers to mark important events, such as someone's ascension to the position of emperor, major victories, and especially any important political moments when emperors needed the army's public support. We can start with an example from Augustus himself. In his will, he left 300 sestertii to every legionary. This equated to 75 denarii, the same value as one of their 3 standard pays throughout the year. Bonuses when a new emperor ascended to the throne were probably the most common of all donatives. When Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus became co-emperors in 161, the Historia Augusta mentions the 2 emperors going to the Praetorian camp in Rome and offering a whopping 5,000 denarii to each Praetorian, with lower but quote-unquote proportional sums being given to the rest of the army. Now, this figure is certainly exaggerated. That would have bankrupted the empire many times over. But at least it illustrates the importance of this donative, especially when given to the Praetorian Guard in Rome. Being the official troops that protected the emperor, they had the final say in someone's ascension to the purple. It's crazy to think that the troops that were supposed to be the closest to the emperor were also the ones who killed most of them. In any case, every emperor knew how powerful the Praetorians were, and when it was time to give the donatives, the Praetorians always received very juicy bribes. As for how much the legions stationed back in the provinces would get, we don't have many sources on direct values. Septimius Severus, upon seizing power in 193, he is more explicit in the sources. He gave 250 denarii to each soldier as an immediate bonus, on top of the raise of the yearly salary he promised. Considering this sum, we can assume that troops during the 2nd century AD could expect at least 1 year worth of wages, so around the 300 denarii mark, as a donative, every time there was a new emperor. As political order broke down during the 3rd century, the lines between like salary and bonuses sort of like became blurred. Every couple of years or so, a new emperor would rise, only to be toppled again shortly after, and with the coinage being debased, losing value and prices rising, and of course with the breakdown of any record keeping, we don't know how much the soldiers earned, so either the salaries were constantly adjusted, or soldiers increasingly depended on these donatives and any kind of windfall to maintain their standard of living. The donative system survived well into the late Roman Empire as well. Apart from that 5-year bonus we discussed earlier, which became this kind of ritualized contract, new emperors also offered a bonus. A surviving edict from the ascension of Emperor Valentinian I claims, "For the commencement of my holy and fortunate reign, I will give 5 solidi and a pound of silver to each shield bearer." So, okay, I think that explains the donative part properly, but there were more sources of income. So let's remember we're talking about professional soldiers here. Their main job was to go to war, and where there's war, there are spoils of war. Looting after a battle or a successful siege was rarely just this, like, grab everything you can. Of course, after a battle there was always some level of pillaging, but in theory, all spoils were supposed to be collected and later distributed in an organized way. There was a cut that would go to the state or the commanders, a cut to the officers, and of course a part to the troops. And there were also special sums given to individuals who received awards for exceptional acts in battle. Just like the donatives, soldiers also expected to receive a share of the loot, and they would be very angry if they didn't receive anything after risking their lives. In the 3rd century, a separatist emperor, Postumus, tried stopping his troops from looting the city of Mogontiacum, a Roman city, mind you, after recapturing it from a counter-usurper. Postumus tried to reason with the troops that they would be robbing their own fellow Romans, but they didn't care. The city was pillaged anyways, and Postumus was killed by his own soldiers. Some of our best accounts of how much a soldier could earn from the spoils of war come from the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. For example, after the Battle of Actium and his proclamation as the first Roman emperor, Augustus publicly boasted of distributing 250 denarii as a bonus to each of his 120,000 soldiers, those who fought on his side against Mark Antony and Cleopatra. And in the 2nd century, the spoils captured by Trajan after the final victory in the Dacian Wars in 106 AD were even more impressive. Staggering quantities of precious metals were captured by Trajan and brought to Rome. This was the famous treasure of Decebalus, the Dacian king. Estimates point to around 165 tons of gold and 331 tons of silver, probably the single biggest capture of loot in Roman history. And we can reasonably expect it led to one of the largest campaigns of loot distribution as well. There's a certain degree of uncertainty on the final amount of metal captured or how much of it was directed towards paying prices to the troops, but even if we get a little bit creative and we use, I don't know, like a conservative estimate of 10% of the treasure being reserved for distribution to the soldiers, a conservative per soldier share could easily surpass a year of salary, like hundreds of denarii per soldier. And that's for the rank and file. Let's not even get started on all of the officers, cavalrymen, the Praetorian Guard, everyone who received more and would have received more as a bonus. There was a lot of gold and silver being distributed that year. And finally, there was one last source of income we should talk about. That is the honesta missio, the bonus you received upon completing your years of service. This would be similar to what an honorable discharge is to modern armies. Under Augustus, the state regularized what they called a premium, a discharge bonus. When you sign up to the legions, you were supposed to serve for this very long term of 25 years. Upon completing this contract, a legionnaire received the equivalent of 3,000 denarii. This could be paid in either missio numaria, cash prices, missio agraria, the ownership of land that was given to the soldier, or a combination of both. This was a very juicy sum of money, over 13 years of pay during the reign of Augustus. Even considering the inflation during the 2nd century, that's still like 10 years worth of salaries. And let's consider this for a minute. Like a young man who enlisted when he was 20 years old, he retired at 45. Considering how long people lived back then, he wouldn't have a particularly long time to enjoy this newly found wealth, but for a young peasant boy or a poor man from the Roman suburbia, the army provided a real possibility of going up the social ladder. And even if he might not have enjoyed the fruits of his retirement for very long, by serving in the army, he could ensure that his children would have had a much better chance at life than he did. Considering the brutal conditions of ancient times, this kind of potential for social mobility was really something the ancient world hadn't seen up to that point. And once you have all of that in consideration, now you know why so many young Roman men endured 2.5 decades of marching, digging, working, getting screamed at by centurions and fighting for Rome, as well as the very bleak 50% likelihood that he would not survive the full 25 years of service. The life of a legionnaire was hard, but the world was simply brutal. Life was brutal. And considering the perspectives most young men had at birth, when you take into account the multiple potential sources of income, it doesn't sound that bad. At least you would not be bored, that's for sure. So, now you know what? I want to hear from you. If you were a poor Roman citizen, would you consider joining the legions, or would you prefer civilian life? Let us know in the comment section below. I hope you enjoyed yet another episode. Leave a like and consider subscribing if you did, and I'll see you soon. Let me give a special thank you to all of my amazing channel members and Patreons for their generous support. This channel would not be the same without your help. And if you would like to be part of this list, have early access to my videos when they are uploaded to YouTube, and a series of other perks, make sure to check out my Patreon page and my members tab on YouTube. Thank you very much.